The security guard's hand locked around the teenager's wrist at exactly 9:32 p.m. on November 8, 1976, at the Philadelphia Spectrum. And in that frozen instant, before everything changed, 20,000 Kiss fans held their collective breath. The boy, 17 years old, with shoulder-length hair and a homemade Kiss Army t-shirt, had made it 3 steps from the stage barrier with Ace Frehley's backup Gibson Les Paul Custom clutched against his chest like a trophy he had just won. The guitar, with its distinctive 3-pickup configuration and tobacco sunburst finish, was still reflecting the stage lights as the security guard yanked the kid backward, the instrument nearly slipping from his trembling hands. The house lights were coming up for the brief intermission between the main set and the encore. The smoke from the pyrotechnics was still hanging in the cold November air, and Ace Frehley, standing stage left in his full Space Ace makeup and silver costume, was watching the entire scene unfold from 15 feet away. What happened in the next 6 minutes would become a legend among Kiss fans, a story passed down through generations of concertgoers, though the full truth of that night would remain largely unknown until the people who witnessed it began sharing their memories decades later. The choice Ace Frehley made in those moments would define not just his relationship with the fans, but would reveal something essential about the man behind the silver makeup. Something that had nothing to do with guitar solos or platinum records or the carefully constructed Space Ace persona. Before we dive into what Ace did that left an entire arena in tears, if you want to hear more stories that reveal the human side of rock's biggest legends, subscribe to our channel. These are the moments that didn't make the official documentaries, the real stories behind the mythology. The Rock and Roll Overture was at its peak when Kiss rolled into Philadelphia that November, and the I Does Boom band had achieved a level of success that seemed almost impossible just 3 years earlier when they were playing clubs to audiences that sometimes numbered in the dozens. The Destroyer album, released earlier that year, had given them their first real crossover hit with Detroit Rock City and Shout It Out Loud, songs that were getting radio play beyond the hard rock stations that had been their initial supporters. But it was the live show that had transformed Kiss from a successful band into a cultural phenomenon, and by November 1976, their concerts were events that transcended music, theatrical productions that combined rock and roll with circus-level spectacle in a way that had never been done before. The Philadelphia Spectrum held a special place in Kiss's history, a venue where they had played multiple times during their rise and where the audience had embraced them with particular intensity. Pennsylvania had become Kiss territory, cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh treating the band like hometown heroes despite them being from New York. The fans here were different too, more intense, more devoted, the kind of audience that would paint their faces in homemade versions of the band's makeup and arrive at the venue hours before doors opened just to be close to the stage barrier. Ace Frehley's role in Kiss had evolved significantly by 1976, and while Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley remained the primary creative forces and business minds behind the operation, Ace had become the cool factor. The guitarist whose playing style influenced a generation of musicians and whose Space Ace character represented something that the other personas didn't quite capture. There was a mystery to Ace, a distance that made him compelling. While Gene breathed fire and spit blood, while Paul connected directly with the audience through constant engagement, Ace stood in his designated zone stage left, smoking guitar in hand, letting the music speak for itself. The silver makeup made him look alien, otherworldly, and that distance created a fascination that was different from the raw power of Gene's demon or the accessible charisma of Paul's starchild. But the reality behind that makeup was more complex than anyone in the audience understood, And it would be that reality that emerged on the night a kid tried to steal his guitar. The equipment that Kiss used in 1976 was custom-built for the demands of their show, and Ace's guitars were particularly important because his playing style required specific modifications that couldn't be found in standard instruments. His main guitar, the Gibson Les Paul Custom that had become as much a part of his image as the silver makeup, was supplemented by multiple backup instruments that were kept stage-ready in case of broken strings or technical issues. These backup guitars weren't just functional replacements. They were identical to the main instrument in terms of setup and sound, each one representing thousands of dollars in equipment and modifications. For a professional musician at Ace's level, losing a guitar wasn't just losing an instrument. It was losing a tool that had been specifically crafted to do a job that no other guitar could do in quite the same way. The stage setup at the Philadelphia Spectrum that night followed Kiss's standard configuration from the Rock and Roll Over tour, with Ace's guitars positioned on stands at the rear of his performance area, accessible but protected by the natural barrier of the stage itself and the security personnel who were stationed at regular intervals along the front barrier. In theory, those guitars were untouchable, separated from the audience by 4 feet of vertical drop from stage to floor, and by the security guards whose job was to prevent exactly the kind of incident that was about to occur. But security in 1976 was different from the lockdown protocols that would emerge in later decades, and there were always moments during a show when attention shifted, when the thousands of moving parts that made a Kiss concert function created brief windows where the impossible could become possible. The intermission between the main set and the encore was one of those windows, a moment when the stage crew would rush to check equipment, when band members might step briefly into the wings, when the house lights would come up and security attention would diffuse across the entire arena rather than focusing on the stage barrier. It was precisely this moment that the 17-year-old fan had been waiting for, though whether he had planned this attempt or simply acted on impulse would remain unclear even years later when he finally told his version of the story. The moment that security guard grabbed his wrist was the moment when a simple theft attempt transformed into something that would be remembered for 40 years. The kid's name was Danny Kowalski, and in November 1976 he was living in a row house in South Philadelphia with his parents and 2 younger sisters, working part-time at a grocery store and spending every dollar he could spare on records and concert tickets. Kiss had become his obsession in the way that only a teenage obsession can manifest. The band representing everything that his everyday life in working-class Philadelphia was not. Freedom, power, escape, transformation. He had seen Kiss twice before, once at the Tower Theater in Upper Darby and once at the Spectrum the previous year, and each time he had left the venue feeling like he had experienced something that transcended normal entertainment, something that was closer to a religious experience than a rock concert. The idea to try to take the guitar had formed during the main set, watching Ace perform Cold Gin with a fury that made the instrument seem like an extension of his body rather than a separate object. Danny had noticed the backup guitars on their stands, had noticed the brief moments when security attention shifted toward crowd surges near the barrier, had noticed the pattern of when stage crew would be most distracted. He didn't think of it as stealing. In his 17-year-old mind, he thought of it as claiming a piece of the magic, taking home something that would prove he had been close to the gods who walked that stage. When the main set ended and the house lights came up, Danny made his move with a speed and determination that surprised even him. He pushed through the crowd to the barrier, timed his jump to coincide with a security guard turning to deal with a disturbance 20 feet away, pulled himself up onto the stage with the kind of adrenaline-fueled strength that he didn't normally possess, grabbed the nearest guitar from its stand, and started back toward the edge before his brain caught up with what his body was doing. For maybe 3 seconds, it seemed like it might actually work. The guitar was in his hands. He was moving. The edge of the stage was right there. And then the security guard's hand locked around his wrist, and everything stopped. The guard was a man in his 30s named Frank Morrison, a veteran of Philadelphia venue security who had worked everything from soul reviews to punk shows, and his reaction to seeing a kid on the stage with a guitar was immediate and professional. The grab was firm but not violent, designed to stop movement without causing injury, and his other hand was already reaching for his radio to call for backup. In Frank's experience, this kind of incident usually ended in one of 2 ways. Either the kid would drop the guitar and run, or he would hold on and get dragged to venue security office, where police would be called and charges would be filed. What Frank didn't expect was for Ace Frehley to walk over. The Space Ace had been at the rear of the stage when the grab happened, conferring with his guitar tech about a tuning issue on the main instrument, and the commotion at stage left caught his attention immediately. From his position, Ace could see the entire tableau: the teenage kid with terror in his eyes, the security guard with professional grip and stance, the 20,000 fans who had gone quiet watching the scene unfold, the backup guitar that was now the center of this unscripted drama. What ran through Ace's mind in that moment was something that no one in the arena could have predicted. A thought process that came not from the Space Ace persona, but from Paul Daniel Frehley, the kid from the Bronx who had grown up without much money, and who remembered what it felt like to want something so badly that rational thinking disappeared. Ace walked across the stage with his platform boots making deliberate sounds on the wooden surface, each step captured by 20,000 pairs of eyes as the arena remained suspended in unusual silence. The silver makeup on his face was running slightly from sweat. The LED lights built into his costume were still blinking their programmed patterns, and as he approached the security guard and the terrified teenager, something in his body language made it clear that this wasn't going to end the way anyone expected. What Ace Frehley said next would become the most quoted line in Philadelphia Kiss fan history, though it would be years before most people outside that arena would hear about it. Ace looked at the security guard first, not at the kid, and in a voice that was calm and quiet but carried authority, he said something that made Frank Morrison release his grip immediately. Then Ace turned to Danny Kowalski, the 17-year-old whose life was flashing before his eyes, and instead of anger or accusation, there was something else in the Space Ace's expression, something that was visible even through the elaborate makeup. Ace looked at the guitar in Danny's hands, the tobacco sunburst Gibson Les Paul Custom that was worth more than most people in that arena made in 6 months, and he looked back at the kid's terrified face, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with logic or business or protecting expensive equipment. Ace told Danny to keep the guitar, not as a joke, not as a gesture that would be reversed once cameras were off. He told the kid to keep it, to take it home, to learn to play it, to remember this night every time he picked it up. The arena, which had been holding its breath, erupted in a sound that started as confusion and transformed into something else entirely, a collective release of emotion that was different from the usual concert screaming. This was something raw and real, a moment of humanity that broke through the theatrical distance that normally separated performers from audience. And as the reality of what was happening sank in across 20,000 people, the tears started. The crying wasn't universal, and it wasn't immediate for everyone, but it spread through the spectrum like a wave, starting with the people closest to the stage who could see Danny's face as Ace spoke to him, who could see the security guard step back, who could see Ace put his hand on the kid's shoulder in a gesture that was pure kindness with no performance element to it at all. The emotion spread to people in the upper decks who could see the scene but couldn't hear the words, spread to people who only understood from the reactions of those around them that something extraordinary was occurring, spread until fathers were wiping their eyes, and mothers were sobbing, and teenagers were experiencing the kind of cathartic emotional release that they would remember for the rest of their lives. But the story of that night was only beginning, and what happened backstage after the encore would add layers to the legend that even the people in the arena didn't know. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had watched the entire incident from the wings, and their reactions to Ace's decision were complicated by the business realities that they managed as much as they managed the creative aspects of Kiss. That guitar represented significant money that came out of their collective bottom line. The insurance and liability implications of giving equipment to someone who had technically committed theft were potentially serious. And there was the precedent question. If you give a guitar to one kid who tries to take one, what message does that send to every other fan in every other city on the tour? From a pure business standpoint, Ace's decision was questionable at best. But from a human standpoint, from the perspective of what Kiss represented to their fans and what that relationship meant, Ace's gesture was something else entirely. It was proof that underneath the makeup and the fire and the blood and the spectacle, there were real people who understood what the music meant to the people who listened to it, who remembered what it was like to be on the other side of that barrier, looking up at gods on a stage. Gene and Paul, whatever their initial reservations might have been, understood this dimension too, and by the time Ace came off stage after the encore, the decision had been collectively accepted. The encore that night was charged with an energy that even the band members commented on later, describing it as one of the most powerful performances of the entire tour. When Kiss returned to the stage after the intermission, the audience reaction was unlike anything they had experienced before, a combination of gratitude and love and respect that went beyond normal fan appreciation. The performance of Rock and Roll All Night that closed the show became a communal celebration, the entire spectrum singing every word, 20,000 voices unified in a moment of pure connection between artists and audience. Danny Kowalski was taken backstage after the encounter, not to a security office but to Kiss's dressing room area, though not to meet the band immediately. A road manager named Jeff sat with him, getting his information, making sure he understood that the guitar was really his to keep, explaining some of the basic care and maintenance that an instrument like that required. Danny, still in a state of shock, could barely process what was happening. The guitar that had been in his hands during the theft attempt was now resting in a case with a Kiss logo on it, officially his, along with a set list from that night's show and a Polaroid photo that Jeff took of Danny holding the instrument. The full significance of what Ace had done wouldn't become clear until years later, when the guitar's history revealed details that even Ace himself had forgotten in the moment. The Gibson Les Paul Custom that Danny Kowalski took home that night wasn't just any backup guitar. It was an instrument that Ace had used during the recording sessions for the Destroyer album earlier that year, which meant it had been played on tracks like Detroit Rock City and God of Thunder, songs that would become Kiss classics. The guitar had been relegated to backup status not because of any deficiency in sound or playability, but simply because Ace's main instrument had slightly different pickup configurations that he preferred for live performances. Inside the guitar case, there was a small notebook where Ace's guitar tech had logged tuning specifications and string gauges, and on one of the pages there was a handwritten note from Ace himself, a reminder about a bridge adjustment that needed to be made before the next tour leg. Danny didn't discover these details immediately. In the days after the concert, he was too overwhelmed by the reality of owning the guitar to think about its history. His parents, initially horrified by the story of how their son had ended up with a stolen instrument, were eventually convinced by the documentation Jeff had provided that the guitar was legitimately Danny's. The local Philadelphia news picked up the story in a small human interest segment, interviewing Danny and showing footage of him holding the guitar, though the coverage focused more on the feel-good aspect of a rock star's generosity than on the deeper implications of the gesture. For Kiss, the Philadelphia incident became part of their internal legend, but not something they publicized extensively. There was no press release, no official statement, no attempt to turn Ace's spontaneous act of kindness into a marketing opportunity. In interviews during the remainder of the Rock and Roll Over tour, when asked about memorable moments, band members would occasionally reference something special that happened in Philadelphia without going into details, leaving the fans who had been there to tell the story themselves. And tell the story they did, transforming the Philadelphia Spectrum concert of November 8, 1976 into something more than just another tour date. The fan network that existed in 1976 was different from anything that would emerge in later decades. Built on word of mouth and letters and fan club newsletters rather than instant, digital communication. But the Philadelphia story spread through that network with remarkable speed. Kiss fans who hadn't been at the show heard about it from fans who had been there, and the story grew in the telling, the details becoming more elaborate, the emotional impact becoming more intense. By the time the tour reached its end, fans in cities that Kiss hadn't even visited yet knew about the kid who had tried to take Ace's guitar and had been allowed to keep it. The impact on Kiss's relationship with their fan base was subtle but significant. The band had always positioned themselves as accessible, as connected to their audience in ways that bigger bands from earlier eras had not been. But the Philadelphia incident provided concrete proof of that connection. It became common at Kiss concerts for fans to bring signs thanking Ace for his kindness, for his understanding, for proving that the Space Ace character was inhabited by a real person with real empathy. For Ace himself, the gesture was consistent with a pattern of behavior that his bandmates and road crew had observed throughout his time with Kiss, a tendency toward spontaneous generosity that often conflicted with the business-focused approach that Gene and Paul preferred. Ace would give guitar picks to kids who asked, would stop to sign autographs when the schedule didn't really allow for it, would go out of his way to acknowledge fans who clearly needed acknowledgement. The Philadelphia incident was simply the most visible and dramatic example of this tendency, the moment when Ace's natural inclination toward kindness intersected with circumstances that allowed it to be seen by thousands of people at once. The decades that followed would add new dimensions to the story, as Danny Kowalski's life took unexpected turns that seemed almost impossibly connected to that November night. Danny did learn to play the guitar that Ace gave him, and while he never became a professional musician, the instrument changed his life in ways that he wouldn't fully understand until much later. The discipline required to learn guitar translated into other areas of his life, helping him get through difficult periods in his 20s when the Philadelphia economy collapsed and jobs disappeared. The guitar became a family heirloom, something his children and eventually grandchildren would see as a tangible connection to a moment of grace and kindness that had happened before most of them were born. In 1996, 20 years after the Philadelphia Spectrum incident, Danny contacted Kiss management through official channels, requesting permission to meet Ace again. The meeting was arranged during a tour stop in Philadelphia, and when Danny walked into the backstage area carrying the case with the guitar inside, Ace's reaction was immediate recognition despite 2 decades of time. The guitar had been maintained impeccably, the original strings long since replaced, but the instrument itself showing the kind of care that comes from genuine appreciation rather than just preservation of value. What Ace told Danny during that meeting would remain private between the two men, but people who were present said that the Space Ace's eyes were visibly wet behind the makeup when Danny thanked him for changing his life. The gift that had seemed like a spontaneous gesture in 1976 had become something larger, a moment of kindness that had rippled through decades and touched lives that Ace couldn't have anticipated when he told a terrified teenager to keep the guitar. The story of the Philadelphia Spectrum concert on November 8, 1976, exists now in multiple forms. The official Kiss history that barely mentions it, the fan accounts that have been passed down through generations, and the private memory that Danny Kowalski carries with him. The guitar itself, now over 45 years old, remains in Danny's possession, though he has been offered substantial sums by collectors who recognize its significance. His refusal to sell is not about the money or the collector value. It's about preserving something that can't be quantified in dollars. A physical reminder that beneath the silver makeup and the platform boots and the pyrotechnics, there was a man from the Bronx who understood what it meant to want something desperately, and who chose kindness when he could have chosen punishment. For Ace Frehley, the Philadelphia incident represents something essential about his complicated relationship with fame and with the Space Ace character that defined his public image for so many years. The man who would struggle with addiction and interpersonal conflicts and the pressures of celebrity was also the man who looked at a scared kid holding a stolen guitar and saw not a thief, but a fan who had made a stupid decision out of desperate love for the music. That duality, that capacity for both self-destruction and profound empathy, makes Ace's gesture all the more meaningful because it came from a place of genuine understanding rather than calculated public relations. The 20,000 people who were in the Philadelphia Spectrum that night received something they hadn't paid for when they bought their tickets. They received proof that the mythology Kiss had built around themselves wasn't completely divorced from reality, that the connection between band and fans wasn't just a marketing construct, but could be real and human and transformative. The tears that spread through the arena were tears of recognition, an acknowledgement that in a world increasingly dominated by corporate entertainment and carefully managed celebrity images, there could still be moments of authentic human kindness. And for those who understand what rock and roll meant in 1976, when it represented not just music, but a set of values about authenticity and rebellion and connection, Ace Frehley's decision to let Danny Kowalski keep that guitar stands as a perfect embodiment of those values, a moment when the mythology became reality, and when the Space Ace proved that the best thing about being a god was having the power to show mercy.